Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. This is pretty awesome. Can you please confirm that my screen is shared and that you can hear me well?
We can hear you.
Perfect, perfect. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Adobe, for hosting us. This is great. I'm really excited. I'm one of these people that really likes to talk about innovation and technology and what we're finding and what we're listening from customers. So I'm excited to be here and kind of share like this the journey that we've been going through like the last few years and what we're kind of listening, what we're kind of hearing from customers and from these really high-tech, high-moving companies. So thanks again for having me. So I really like when presentations like these are really interactive. So you can see on the right side of what on the screen that I'm sharing that we can use slido.com to ask questions. Everybody can see all the questions that have been asked. You can vote up and down to the questions that you really like, and we will see them there, and I'll try to interact as much as possible. So please feel free to interrupt me and ask any questions, any clarifying questions, or something that we need to zoom in so that we tailor the content towards what's interesting to the group. So yeah. So I really wanted to take this opportunity to talk about software localization specifically. I know that a lot of you guys are building software and software products. But in reality, a part of this is not only about building products, but a lot of integrations that exist today for localization, for content management systems, for documentation systems are really based on the same principles. So the way that I prepared the presentation is kind of go over how did localization evolve for software, and then where are we today and what are the challenges that we're facing today. And I wanted to kind of give a glimpse of what we're seeing coming in the next few years. So the biggest problem with software localization is that all the technology for software localization has really been built in the 90s when the programming languages were built. And it's the classic idea, like back then, like remember 1990 doesn't sound too far back, but we used modems back then. And the best mobile device was a Game Boy that had like 2 colors on it, right? So it's actually not an exaggeration to say that, the basic architecture was built back then. And it's the idea that localization happens in resource files, right? A developer goes and in their code writes the phrases and marks them with some special tags. Sometimes they need to prepare IDs as well, not just prepare like the actual content, but choose IDs. And in many cases, the content doesn't even live in here. They need to choose an ID and then put it in another file, the ID with the phrases, right? Then these phrases end up in translation files that contain the source content and copies of those translation files to contain the translations. That's the standard way that programming languages work. That's what when you go to python.org, Ruby, Java, Microsoft Technologies, all this is what you're going to find as a developer. You need to, if you want to do something more modern, you need to do your own research and go and find more modern platforms. But the reality is that 9 out of 10, maybe more, developers and product teams are using this kind of technology. The problem is that, again, it was built in the 90s, right? So what used to work back then doesn't mean that it's still working really well today. So as an example, take when shipping packages around the world back then, you had this idea where you put everything in the ship and then send it over and then wait for a month and get it back. It's kind of similar. Back then, we used to build softwares very, very differently, right? We used to put them on CDs, and we used to actually send them over somehow to the user with zip files and things like that. And really, like, software was released every few months, sometimes every year, right? And the idea was that you had the software installed on your desktop, right? And that meant that you're not expected to update that software very frequently. Obviously, things have changed since then, right? We're using emails and maps in the browser. When Google Maps introduced Google Maps, that was in the browser, you didn't need to download anything. It was pretty spectacular that you could do these kind of things as a service, right? So we no longer really use desktop apps as much. There's Adobe Photoshop and stuff, but even all those kind of software go in the cloud now, right? So the interesting thing is when we first built Transifex, and this was quite a long time ago, that this is the open source email I wrote about the first version, and Transifex started as an open source project. It was back in 2007. The idea, even back then, was to make it really easy for developers and translators to work together. Back then in the Fedora project, we had this problem that we had a bunch of files that lived in a bunch of repositories, and translators had a really difficult time actually finding those files and translating them. So we felt that the best thing that we could do is build a localization platform that allows developers and product teams to do their work really well and to make them actually love localization. Fast forward more than 13 years later, I don't think that we still achieved that vision. Like many of the people here, they have developers in their companies, and I'm pretty sure if you ask them, they're not going to tell you, hey, yes, of course, localization. Let me help you with that. Let me drop what I'm doing and come and help you. And it was kind of similar with other areas of development around coding, like DevOps and things like that. But that has changed as tools evolved. Developers started loving these side projects rather than just build the product of the company, right? So I think 13 years later, we still haven't achieved this vision. We're getting there. But when we did a retrospective and think, okay, how does the next 10 years look for Transifex? Where do we need to go to make localization available to every developer in the world and not have to wait until the company is like 200 people before they localize? And I think the common denominator that we found is that the biggest problem is resource files. Every single bit of innovation that we wanted to do had a bottleneck around the architecture of resource files. It's like when you build a house with bricks. You can build great houses with bricks, but then as things evolve, as technology evolves, the things that you are realizing now you're able to build with cranes and with steel and things like that is way different. In fact, I was recently listening to a presentation by Lawrence Lessig, and he had this picture of New York. It's kind of clear where like the buildings that were built in the 80s stopped and where the skyscrapers began, where we started finding like the new technologies. So what's the problem with the existing system? Well, first and foremost, managing files is slow and cumbersome. Even if you add automation, it's not as fast as developers want. Number two, there's a lot of errors involved, especially when you have translators take the files from somewhere, from an FTP site, from wherever, and download them and translate them and put them back on. It's very error prone. And to make things worse, with Agile, you can fix errors very fast. But if you have this manual process of downloading the files, you're blocking developers from fixing things. So if there's a typo in the application, the developer might not fix it because in order to get translations done, they need to freeze development and wait for translations to come back. So it's not only error prone, but it's hard to fix errors even when you know they're there. Like I said, translation very frequently blocks releases. The vast majority of the language service providers out there are begging you not to change the files while they're working on them. So companies want to work on a phrase level, and LSPs not only cannot usually work on a phrase level, they work on a file level, but sometimes they work on a package level, like multiple files at the same time that you're not allowed to touch. Most file formats today do not have good support of context, like where did this phrase come from? Is it a button? Is it a heading 1 in my home page that I need to pay 3 times the attention than a small error box? Where's the screenshot? Where's the URL that this shows up? Is this a phrase that shows to my enterprise customers, or is it just an obscure phrase that never shows up? This is the popular phrase. Do a lot of people see this phrase? There's not any kind of metadata support in the file formats. Change management is super difficult. Even if you store files in the repository, Git wasn't built to manage things on a phrase level like that. And the translation tools are not meant to be integrated into Git. Because again, if the developer changes a part of the file and you change that part of the file, there's going to be a merge conflict. And finally, like if you have dynamic content in your database, it just breaks down. And so many companies today not only have dynamic content in their database, but they piecemeal together the web app or the mobile app from different libraries together in microservices. So it really breaks down very, very fast. So you would imagine that Transifex customers might be like really big companies that are pushing the envelope, but no, even if you have like just weekly releases from a very small team in 2 languages, like resource files are really like breaking down. So it's not that it's a bad technology, it's that time has evolved and progressed, and technology has progressed, and what used to be like really, really good just is not like a good fit for most fast-moving companies. And the interesting thing is that with very fast releases, translators have an issue. Like developers are working too fast for the translators, right? Translators cannot keep up. But then even if you have 6-month release cycles, translators might want to fix things, and content collaborators might want to fix things, but developers are saying, wait, well, we cannot really deploy these translations because our next release is in a month. And this is actually very present with downloadable applications and mobile apps. So it's really like trying to make the technology work with today's constants and today's environment. So what caused this issue? Well, we're 30 years later, obviously, than when these technologies have been built. And the modern web development frameworks, mobile app development frameworks are really, really different. They encourage a company to have 100 branches open at the same time. And not only 100 branches, but their app consists of many smaller apps. Just Transifex, which we have 15 developers, we have 40 different microservices. And I think the team hates it and wants to go to 60 in the next year. So not only you have multiple branches in each repository, but you have multiple repositories as well. And then a lot of these technologies are not just a single file format. You have multiple file formats. And then what about machine translation? When do you apply machine translation? Where do you apply machine translation versus your human translations versus a 3-step review process? There's really no metadata that can decide that. So this is like what pushed like localization to evolve a lot the last few years. And the first step was obviously add automation, which automation really means just sync these files like very, very frequently. It means use the same architecture, just do it faster. And it works for many companies, but it also doesn't work for many others. Like if your LSP is used to downloading files and translating offline, if you sync more frequently than they're starting their jobs, it will fail. If you ask for them for a quote, they give you a quote, they start translating, and you need to fix a problem, then you're stuck, right? So there's a lot of problems even with today's automation platforms like Transifex, right? Even the modern platforms. You have a lot of small files that LSPs are not very used to. You have very small translation jobs, which cause the issues we talked about. And then it's really hard to merge on a phrase level, again, when small changes happen here and there in the files. And from the customer side, developers are really complaining that there's just too many darn file formats. Usually companies want to encourage their developers to use multiple platforms and switch from teams to teams. That's what keeps developers excited in companies. And then if you have to learn multiple syntaxes, it's just a problem. People will make mistakes and build processes will break. and then, releases will be delayed. So really, like even with automation, companies are pushing for more than what the current tools are asking. So we set out a few years ago, like a couple of years ago, to think, all right, what does the ideal software localization tech stack look like? So we went and talked to a lot of our customers, a lot of other companies that are not our customers. We went and talked with industry leaders that actually did this really well internally, like Facebook, Google, Netflix, even smaller companies that have innovated and built their own technologies like Airbnb and Square and Box. And we thought, okay, let's collect all the ideas together that if a developer built this today, how would they build it? So the question we asked in the beginning of the call was, what does the perfect localization tech stack look like for you? And we collected the following findings. By the way, I'll make like a small stop here to share. Again, feel free to interrupt me with questions, or we can just keep them at the end. I don't mind either. So what did we find? First, everybody hates having files. It's a problem, and developers hate going and changing the files when you need something from them, and it just breaks everything down. Even the fact that you have multiple files, multiple copies of the same file, just because the platform doesn't support anything differently, it's a huge problem. So everybody believed that I want a more flexible way to manage my phrases. It has to be in a database. It cannot live with the code. We can cache it with the code, deploy it, but the source of truth should not be the code, because everything breaks once you have that. And the second thing around files is that not only we shouldn't have files, but we should make phrases the unit. The common denominator should be phrases. What does this mean? It means that if I have a phrase in Android and iOS, I want the translation to be the same. But I don't want the LSP to fix the translation. I want when a developer changes a phrase in one of the two platforms, I want them to know that this phrase was used somewhere else. So they actually want even English phrases to be a top-level citizen. Which brings us to the second point, which is people don't want translation from us. They want global content management. It's very different. Translation is that process where you take the files, you throw it over the wall, over the fence to the LSP, and then they take care of everything else, and then you just get it back. And yes, many localization managers are used to working like that. Many LSPs are used to working like that. But there's a reason why small companies like Transifex, SmartLink, PhraseUp, all of these have such popularity, is because customers are pushing the envelope on that, and that's not good enough. Like usually what we found is a lot of customers come to a modern platform because they're dissatisfied with the LSP, not the technology that they have as a company, but the interaction with the LSP, and it's really the tooling the problem. So in the heart of this is not only about the customer having full access to the translation memory and full access to each phrase and seeing where the phrase is and being able to pull translations at all time and all these things, which means they shouldn't take the English file, apply the TM to get the translation files. The translation files are available at all times. They can download them every time they merge a branch, for example. So that's one concept. The second is they want to manage their source phrases together with their translations. They want to be able to upload screenshots on top of the source phrases so that translators know where they come from. They want to be able to say this phrase, do not translate it, and have a tool to be able to do that. And every time you send a new file, you want the same instruction for the same phrase to show up. You really don't want a new file to override the instructions you gave just because we're used to work with this translation job model. And the other thing is that they really want all their content centrally managed in a central location. So the source of truth, again, not be like the individual files or the LSP's TM. It needs to be something that the customer can manage and can sync at all times. And some of the modern companies that I talked about before that are showing the way to other companies, I guess, and to us, how things should be done, it developed exactly this, like a central content database. And my favorite quote was from a developer that really said that I love localization, but I hate it. It's just ugly, and I just wish it was easy and fun. And that struck me. Like we keep talking with our product team in Transifex all the time about how can we make this fun and easy and fluid and seamless that you cannot see the seams, right? The third thing is, again, edit the source language. And like this is included a little bit in the previous one, but I wanted to put more deliberate attention here because it's a model where us as translation specialists do not think about a lot. Companies work on the English content just like we're working on the translation content. The developer might write a phrase in the app, but then a product person might want to fix that phrase. Like a lot of companies are applying A/B testing and analytics to see which phrases work better. And they might find a small error. So what happens when they find an error? They go in Jira, they open a Jira ticket, and then the developer needs to see that Jira ticket and go and fix it in the code, stop what they're doing, fix it in the code, and then they need to create a new deployment. It's just a mess. So developers really are good at writing features, but they're not good at managing the content. So if we maintain the idea that the source code is where the source content lives, you're immediately making the developer the person responsible to fix the English content. So the people that we interviewed asked us, I want our product managers and I want our English experts and I want our copywriters to be able to just go in an interface and fix the content, like I do with my CMS. If I have Drupal, I log in Drupal and I fix it. I don't need to ask someone else to go and fix it. But with developers, you have to do that, right? So this also means that people are eager to start localizing, start managing their global content really much before they're ready to localize. So they want to localize from English to English kind of before they're ready to go to multiple languages, just like they're usually eager to go from US English to UK English or Canada English, for example, or after they went to Portuguese, before going to new languages, they want to do Brazilian Portuguese, right? So it's that kind of smaller step before they actually localize, which I think is really powerful if companies could do that. The fourth one is they want to deploy content regardless on when the developers want to deploy their code. So this means managing the phrase outside of the code, but allow them to deploy them at all times. So it's especially critical for mobile apps, where even if you update your app, even if your coding team has automated everything and they publish a new version of the app, maybe the users will not have downloaded the latest version. One of our customers, Viber, has like 8 versions at the same time live or more out there because just people do not have an internet connection. Maybe they disabled automatic updates. So how do you fix a small problem in your app if you don't release a new language? Well, you cannot do that with files. You need a different system. I think with CMSs, that's less of a problem and marketing content because, again, it's hosted on the web. So the TMS can really publish the translations live, but it's a big problem with apps and databases. The other thing that developers have asked that is for a unified syntax. So, I mean, ICU is a great standard, and many companies are forced to use ICU and forced to find libraries that support ICU. But really, each programming language has its own format and its own syntax. So the companies need to go way beyond their standard scope to develop something if they want unified syntax. A great example that Brian McConnell, that used to be at Lyft, told me is that they brought like dozens, literally dozens, like 50 developers to work on improving their support and develop libraries for every programming language that they have in order to have a unified syntax. And if you have unified syntax, you're also able to go and reduce the number of file formats that you use. The other thing that came up was a lot of companies are actually adopting these platforms and integrate them really deeply into their developer stack and their, the fabric of how they build products, their developer operations and their content operations. And each company is different. And I think all the localization platforms, TMS, technology companies, I think if you ask all the CTOs and the head of products, they will tell you, we're just being asked to do too many things. Each company has different requirements. And obviously, I mean, if you have integrated something so much into your code and into how you build stuff, companies want to customize it. Like even the simplest example that I can bring here is some companies want to do pseudo localization differently. They might want to test other languages, or they might want to have multiple review steps, or they might want to cache translations differently. So the only way that really you can do this well is if you build the technology bottoms up like this. So it has to be open source so that the customers have access to the code. And it has to be truly open source where you can co-develop the technology with the community, not just open source and you're the steward and, hey, you can fork the repository and do whatever you want, but we're not going to merge the changes. And the other thing that is super important for many companies, especially medium to large ones, is they want to control how they publish the translations to their users. This is why solutions like the proxy servers that some companies out there have is just not liked by companies that are really serious about their infrastructure. You cannot rely on either an LSP or even a dedicated technology company for your website. It's too risky, and it just breaks the user experience. It's slow, and it might lead to a lot of security issues. So customers want to control this last mile of the content deployment. The other thing that came was dynamic content, that a lot of content today lives in databases, does not live in files. Even if we want it, it doesn't live in files. So customers are trying to take the content out and put it in a file and send it to the LSP, and that's not how databases work. Like, again, you will need to freeze your content and then find a way to merge that new file into your database. And this makes it even worse, obviously, with user-generated content. Like, we live in an era where we have an explosion of content, and technologies today only make it more possible to generate content very, very fast. And yeah, this will push the envelope even more in the next few years. And finally, something that is pretty new, I think, in our industry, and very, very few companies are asking it, but I think customers out there and organizations are asking for it much more than we are talking about it, is metadata. Not only context for translators, but the companies want to store metadata that will allow them to decide which LSP to use, how many review steps, should I send it to a machine translation or not? Should I send it to this machine translation that is better trained for this kind of translations? Should I use a post-MT editing workflow or a human translation or just MT? As a simple example, LinkedIn has like their documentation site, not in 100 languages, but in a couple dozen. So the problem is, okay, it's a big cost, and how do we choose what to send to MT and what not to send? It's all about the metadata. And different companies have different kinds of metadata. Some of them want to store just, developer comments that come from the developer. But in many cases, you might want context that comes from the design tool, from Sketch and Figma, into the TMS. Sometimes you want metadata around the phrase popularity. If it's a very popular phrase, I will want to manage it differently. So there's no way to do this with file formats, and there's no way to do this if you just use one of the repo translation management systems out there. They don't support arbitrary metadata. So this is approximately how like a modern localization infrastructure should look like. And I mean, today, like we use file formats and connectors and libraries, but these boxes here should be replaced by a single function that syncs content directly from your code, your databases, your CMSs into a central content repository. And then this can choose what kind of translation jobs should be triggered. Sometimes the translators need to work inside this repository, especially for micro translation jobs. But everything lives in there, and the source of truth is this repository, not the code. And I think the most critical part, one of the most critical parts in my opinion, is again this ability to build these tools, the customer to be able to build tools around the technology and extend the functionality very easily. This goes beyond just APIs. APIs just allow you to build wrappers around the technology or just build something that is a pre-processing and post-processing tool. I'm talking about tweaking how the technology actually works. How often do you want to sync content, which content to sync, what kind of metadata to store, etc. So that's why I said open source is super important. And today, like, I don't know, like a single platform of the well-known companies out there and the well-known providers that allow companies to actually do that really well. So these are our findings, and after we found, after we did this research and we talked with a lot of people, we decided to build something like this ourselves and make it open source and see where the community takes it. So we built something called Transifex Native, which is really all these concepts kind of together. So they are SDKs, it's internationalization libraries really that you can choose instead of the internationalization library that Python built in the 90s. And it's cloud native, and it syncs your content directly from your code in the cloud. So that's one. So this arrow from the code into the content repository goes directly without going through the file formats, the connectors, or the command line tools. It goes directly in the repository. The second is that it allows us to sync not only the actual content, but metadata around the content, like that this is a button, etc. The other thing is that it allows us to edit the English content in Transifex, and developers could actually switch and use this translated English instead of the developer English. So even if the code says welcome %user, you can change that in the global content repository into welcome %user exclamation mark, and then it goes back. And this is where another request, I didn't put it in the request from developers, is that they need really good quality control tools, because the translator can now break the translations in the build system, but they can also break English, which is until now, it was considered to be very, very stable. And finally, I think one of the most exciting things for me is that we're able to collect rich metadata around the translations, around the source content. That's the right terminology, I think. And we can allow LSPs and the companies to choose really smart workflows. And of course, once you have this, you can actually deploy translations, to Viber apps around the world directly. So you allow product managers and localization managers to choose when to deploy content, and you don't have to rely on developers at all. So there are a couple of platforms today that I know that do this. Obviously, Transifex Native is one. There's another platform called IIT Next. And I know a lot of companies, not a lot, a handful of companies actually that have built something like this. It's a different way of thinking about software localization, a very, very different way. So by no means like we are the only ones that do this. It's a different mentality, a different way of thinking about software localization. And I'm so excited to hearing more companies actually offer something like this and see where this takes us in the next few years. So that's my presentation. I would be more than happy to open this up and discuss this openly with everyone, either through questions on Slido or, yeah, Joe, how do we want to do this? Microphones, chat?
Well, I've placed the link for Slido in the Blue Jeans chat pod a few times, and you can also use the QR code Dimitris is displaying, or just turn on your mic and dive in. Questions, comments,
Actually,
complaints?
Sharing my screen. There is a question, yes. So how is this fileless way of localizing different from other ways? Well, I think a couple of ways that we talked about a couple of ways here. I think the biggest difference is that you can sync content very, very fast. You can deploy translations over the air directly to the user devices. LSPs can work directly on the phrase level, and you can start translating basically from the moment the designer designed the app. So we have a Figma integration, and the designer designs something, the content goes from Figma into the repository. And then translators can start working in there. Even source content editors can actually tweak the content that exists like in Figma and in the design. And then developers start developing. And not only you short-circuited the whole process, right? So you started the source content editing and the translation like really early. So you parallelize the development with the translation. And even after something gets deployed, and developers are encouraged actually to even deploy before translations are complete sometimes. Like we have customers like HubSpot where they have so fast release cycles that they can deploy machine translations for phrases that are not that important. And then they know that within a couple of hours, they can redeploy fresh translations. So I think these are some of the ways that localizing with this kind of continuous localization is very different than the file-based approach, even the automated file-based approach. I hope this helps. Is there visualization of the UI so translators can see the context? It really depends on the platform. IIT Next doesn't do this. In Transifex, yes, there's two ways that you can do it, particularly in our platform. You have a link. If it's a web app, you have a link to the URL that the phrase appears in, and the translators can click on it. And this can even link to a staging server, for example. But there's also support for screenshots. And finally, there's context that comes from the developers, so developers can write comments above the translation in their integrated developing environment, and this goes into the editor, and translators can see this. And there's extra metadata that come from the library. Again, like I mentioned, that this is a button, so that's considered kind of context as well. Someone is asking, where does QA fit into this scheme? Well, there's a couple of things. I'm guessing you mean localization QA, because I talked also about source content QA, after the design phase, etc. But in this case, I don't think that QA, the QA process has changed dramatically. I mean, you still have a translation editor, and you can go in there and have a review step. Even Transifex has a review step and a proofreading step. You can still have that. But I think the biggest change is that you can do QA on a phrase level as well. which means that while your translators are translating, after they finish the first 100 phrases, you can start reviewing them in parallel to how translation is done in the editor while they're translating. So that's something a little bit different. And also, since you have code that runs in the app that controls how the app looks like, one of the features that we're designing, we haven't implemented it yet in Transifex Native, is allow you to open the app in a special mode. And once you, like, I don't know, you have like a hot corner or something like that, a special setting, or even like a special APK to download the app, you can actually pull fresh translations on the fly and QA the translations. You cannot fix it in the app, but even just QAing live translations from the system can be really powerful. And again, because it's on a phrase level, you can also parallelize that and review on the fly while translations are still happening to short circuit the process and move really, really fast. I hope this answered the question. If it didn't, or if we need to zoom in a little bit more, feel free to ask a follow-up question. We have another question. How is it verified that product managers changing text are actually describing what the code does, as opposed to how they would like to think it works? Let me think. I'm not sure if the content, well, in our experience, product managers know better what their product should be doing than the developers. I know it's weird to say that, but sometimes the developers might use a phrase, but it might not describe exactly how we want, the UI to behave. But I think with the editing of the source content, we don't expect product managers to change dramatically, like the phrase, and that one says hello and the other one says sign out, right? You usually want to say, instead of hello, you want to say welcome, right? So in my experience, this hasn't created issues. Yeah, I haven't come across any issues with product managers kind of creating a disconnect between what the phrase says and what the code actually does. How do your clients build the customizable tools you mentioned? Who develops them? Their software or localization or Transifex software that service? Answer is native. Well, you can't do it unless you use Transifex Native because, again, you rely on the internationalization library of your programming language. So yes, this is about Transifex Native really. And the way that we did it is Transifex Native is open source. So in order to use these SDKs, they're fully open source. You can download them and you can see the code. So I'll give you a simple example. One of the things that you can fully customize is how your developers are doing pseudo-localization. So you can apply your own rules so that developers can see long German phrases, tall characters for Chinese, etc., to test their app. So we expect the developers to be able to do this. But if the developers are not able to do this, Transifex offers professional services. It's not our core. We're a product company, but we do offer it when some companies don't have buy-in from developers. But what we have seen is that when you have open source tools that are modern and written well, developers want to hack on them. They want to go and code. So yes, I think we expect the customers engineers to do that, but if there's some specialized custom development, we can do it. One good example about this is that we currently don't support too many programming languages. For example, we don't support Go. But the interesting thing is that all the architecture is already laid down, and we have a porting guide. So your team, if they decide to port the platform to Go, it's much, much easier than building it from scratch because every kind of architectural decision has been made. For example, how do you identify a phrase or what kind of syntax to use? and Transifex native uses ICU. But like everything is kind of figured out already because we ported to a few programming languages and we figured these things out. So even something so big like porting to a new language is easier than it sounds. Nice presentation, thank you. Still, I think that the resource files and native internationalization APIs suit well. For example, Angular 2 has an exclusive way to do internationalization, not verbose at all. Indeed, some of the modern development frameworks have done it so much better than others, like so much better, and it's very exciting to see that. So the syntax is really, really good, and the APIs are good, much, much better than the ones built like 20 years ago. Some of the issues are still there, like you still have language files that get deployed. You still have content that lives in a JavaScript, Angular JavaScript file, and things like that. There are some libraries that do what we described specifically, I think, for Angular, etc., for a company, but none of them are usually integrated with a true, robust translation management system in the backend. So you might be able to do this with Angular and your own database and integrate with Transifex or Smartly, etc. But yeah, I mean, it's very language specific, and usually it's still file based. So it doesn't allow you to do many of the tricks that we talked about. At least that's what I've seen. From Igor, open source is great, but I also want to see a vendor lock-in free solution. Vendor lock-in free. So I see what you're saying. So I think what Igor is saying is, yes, you might have it open source, but since you have integrated into Transifex, it's still tied to a specific platform. I could not agree more. I would love if there was a big component that was open source and there were small bindings that were attached to the specific translation platform, like Transifex. It was a big decision for us when we built it, and we wanted to release something really quickly and iterate a lot. And once we got enough traction to be able to do this like in a more abstract way. So Igor, I think I know which Igor is this, and I'm excited that you mentioned this. And I would be more than happy to collaborate with other companies to extend this and make this truly robust and platform agnostic. I would be thrilled, actually. Igor is also asking, do your SDKs connect only to Transifex or allowed to use some third-party global content repositories, technically and legally? Right now it's Transifex specific, but I think the team has abstracted it enough that it's not too difficult to make it more agnostic. So legally, of course, it's open source. One can fork it freely. And if someone forked the repository and made it platform agnostic, I would be more than happy to look at those changes and merge them back. That's the whole idea behind open source. So yeah, I would be excited to do this. Next question. Transifex costs $70 a month for the basic plan, which is steep for open source projects. How can projects adopt modern localization with crowdsourced translations? Transifex is free for open source projects. So if you have an open source project that is not backed by a huge company, you can use Transifex for free. In fact, some of the biggest open source projects like Python, Django, Bitcoin, even Linus Torvalds himself is using Transifex for their projects. So yeah, I couldn't agree. I agree that even $70 a month for an open source project that is not making any revenue is a lot. Having said that, we do have a lot of open source projects that are backed by big companies, and they have thousands of translators, and they are on a much more expensive plan than $70 a month. Again, they are backed by a big company though. Jane is asking, are you familiar with the Unicode Message Format 2.0 working group? They value your input on numerous open design questions. Yes, I am. And when we first developed this, we were thinking about which syntax to use and everything. So, I mean, yeah, 2.0 is still not there yet. It's been, a work in progress for many years. I would be happy, both me and our tech leads, to provide feedback. I would be more than happy. Igor, you're welcome. Thanks for the good questions. And Catherine is asking, the metadata you mentioned are visible to the customer only internally for their log teams, or translators can see them too in Transifex? So everybody can see them. To answer the question directly, like the metadata that is attached on a phrase is available to everyone. So the workbench that we have is both a translation workbench as well as a content management workbench. So a phrase lives in Transifex, and the phrase can be seen by both the customer and the translator. Some of the metadata is only editable by the customer, but everybody can see them. And you can have arbitrary tags and things like that. But we approach this from the idea that the people that could collaborate on the content are kind of both first-level citizens. So everybody should be able to see the content and the metadata, and not everyone can actually edit them. But yes, everybody can see all the metadata. Now, I think we're taking Transifex, the TMS, not Transifex native. We're taking Transifex to a place where it acts more and more as this global content repository. So I think in the future there will be metadata that will not be visible to translators, or at least there will be mechanisms for customers to choose which metadata to show to the translators, because maybe not all of it is A, useful to translators, but B, maybe some of that is really sensitive metadata, like how popular a phrase is, analytics on top of your phrases, how well they're performing, things like that, or what is the conversion rate of a page using this phrase versus another phrase, which all of this is possible since we're running code, localization code in the app. So I think we're going to get to a place where not all metadata will be visible, actually. Cool. Any other questions? And happy to open up the discussion and discuss openly here as well.
Thank you. Good questions, good answers. Anybody else? Comments, questions, complaints?
Feedback?
Feedback. Great. That was very efficient. I think you've answered all questions. That was great.
Thank you. It was very good.
The other
I just want to say thank you. Very interesting. Thank you. You just need to turn on the camera.
Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine.
Hey, Dimitris. This is Xiang. I have one question. It seems that there have some words limitation within the Q&A, so I cannot put everything in that. So my question is, you mentioned that the localization system, or whatever the localization product manager, can deploy the translation directly to user, not as a part of the deployment of the feature itself. You can do it separately. So my question is, how can we guarantee the quality of the translation from the functional perspective? So sometimes the wrong translation will break the function, especially when the translation cannot handle the placeholder correctly. Yes. So does it mean if we do that as a user, then we need to ask our developer, the core feature directors, to implement the full set of automation testing on the developer side?
It's a great question, actually. I think this issue exists even without like this very modern infrastructure, right? Your translators can go and translate something and break the build, right? This is where you rely on your translation management system to not allow anything to be stored that will break the UI. It has to happen like that. And it was actually one of the big things that developers told us. Maybe I should have included it in there. But yes, it's super important. So the way that we do it, at least with Transifex, is that the TMS, Transifex, the TMS, the localization platform, has a lot of controls around what kind of checks to run before allowing something to be saved. And the simplest, most obvious one is placeholders and variables, right? And where the developer says %user, if you change that, the app will actually crash, right? So there's a couple of things here. One is, yes, the TMS supports all these kinds of checks, and you should apply them to also your English translations with the source content editing. And so we really expect that Transifex will not allow anything that will break the build system to pass through, anything. I think that's something that we have done really well. And the translation checks are very, very reliable, A, across file formats, but B, specifically for native, there's only one syntax. So it's really easy for us to make it better and better and better. And I think number two is that if you really want to do QA, you can. Like, you can launch the app and view the currently live translations in your localization repository at all times. You don't have to download files, tell a developer, deploy it on a staging server. You can have a staging server that shows live translations as they are in your repository. You don't have to sync, you don't have to do anything really. It's available at all times. You don't have to wait for your LSP to send you the files, etc.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Well, I think Igor threw another question into Slido there. And also,
there's another question, yes. How do companies respond to having SDKs installed along their apps? No security or performance concern. Great question, Igor. And yes, developers are concerned or not concerned, hesitant. However, I will say that it's a really, really standard practice nowadays to rely on companies as SDKs to do things. So it's something that we live by and it happens, and it's not something that we invented. But the good news is that the code is open source and the customer can actually see it. In many, many cases, you're asked to install SDKs that you can either not open source and you're not allowed to see the code, or it's obfuscated, etc., and companies still do it. So yes, it's a leap of faith. However, I have trust in the code. It's open source, and so far we haven't heard like a lot of pushback. We heard pushback for other things. Oh, by the way, this brings me like back to Xiang's question, but not really. And in terms of performance, one customer that had a consumer app tested it and saw that there wasn't any issues with performance. But I think the most critical thing, and this is what takes me back to the previous question, is the SDKs can fall back into English if the translation is broken. Because again, we built the internationalization. We can do really smart things like this because it's built now recently. So if there's a problem, any kind of problem with the app, it can use for that particular phrase the English phrase instead of the broken phrase. And this was a requirement by our customer to fall back graciously without breaking the app. So I think we've done that really well in terms of breaking the app. To be honest, I have more security concerns, like, okay, we need to make sure that the code is perfect and everything. But yeah, I would welcome anyone to kind of take a look, and if they find any issues or any performance issues, to submit a pull request, really.
well, if you look in the Blue Jeans chat pod, you'll see Yuka sending her thanks for multiple items here.
Yuka, you're welcome.
Further up the thread there, she said one of the very prominent globalization architects in this industry screamed, "Fileless!" Of course, this is the way to go. Congratulations on achieving this, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big change in the way that we think about things, and we're so ingrained into the classic way of doing things that it was hard even for us to kind of make a vision of this and think, where will it go? Honestly, I think 5 years from now, we will be wondering, why on earth did we do things differently? And this has happened with a lot of things in the coding world. Very, very quickly, you can have these kind of things, especially when there's a coalition of companies kind of supporting this trend. And again, this is not about Transifex native specifically. It's about this way of doing, of localizing software. So yes, I'm very excited.
Dimitris, this is Tex. So it still seems to me, first of all, this has been a trend in the industry for a long time, but today applications need to support so many different platforms that they need to work on, and whether you're supporting a desktop or a phone and so forth. It really seems to me that beyond files, we have to support transporting the layout along with the strings, and that's why I was asking about visualization and QA. What we really need is to be able to express, and this goes back to the programming language, the ability to output, here's what the UI should roughly cover and how it should change as we go from platform to platform, so that you have something that is suitable on an iPhone or a Windows phone with different formats, and then also here's how it's going to look on the desktop. And the application is changing under the covers, but the UI has to be broken out in different ways. So it seems to me, even as you move from files to moving to phrases, it really needs to be accompanied with much more of a user interface at the screen level, and then the translators need to see the visualization of that, and the QA folks also need to be able to work with that, and it all has to be rather seamless and close to real time, so that we can support, an agile approach and to see how these systems are working. And around that, we also need to consider what developers want from a system of content management of user interface is different than what QA people need, and different from what translators and reviewers need. And we really need to be thinking about those different, and I'll throw in the product managers as well, since you were addressing those. So those all have different flows and requirements from how they view this system. And so I think we need more comprehensive approaches. And these are not new ideas either, because I've had discussions with other people in the industry before. This goes back 10 or 20 years. We kind of have a vision for what is needed, but we're still not making those steps or leaps. So I would look for the system that you've got to also be planning some growth away from even phrase level to a more holistic view of what a user interface needs to look like, and for who the users are of such a system. Would you comment on that? I know it's kind of broad picture, but
there's two things I can say. One is, I think talking to developers and product companies, the issues I brought up were the most popular ones that I mentioned. I think tweaking the UI depending on the language is something that is interesting. It's not the biggest pain right now, at least for most of the companies that we talk with. Having said that, one of the really beautiful things about building an internationalization, a universal internationalization system that is evolving and it's modern, is that you can do really cool things with it. So, for example, we're building like Transifex Native with a plugin architecture, and it shouldn't be too difficult for someone to say, you know what, I want to build a plugin and extend the functionality and allow to use this kind of metadata to choose the color of a button based on the language. So this way you can actually tweak the UI based on the language or the metadata on top of each phrase. So I think with this technology, what you're talking about is possible, and you don't even have to wait for Transifex to develop it, because again, it's open source and it's extensible. This is a great example of why these technologies have to be customizable, because customers really care about how they work. We're long away from this model that we throw the translations over the wall to the LSP, and we rely on just their interpretation of how something should be translated, and it's only text. So, yeah, text.
Yeah, I think we've always been able to put into localization files things like colors and dimensions of buttons and things like that so that they're editable, but we still need to have some visualization and display and to understand the impact and know what is being affected. So it's a little bit more than just how the strings are managed with values in them. So the key value pairs. But anyway, we're making progress slowly in the industry. Some of this is back to how programming languages work and separating some of the UI from the underlying code. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. It's a good point you made, and I think it reinforces again why I think this should allow customers to extend it and why open source is super important.
Okay, well, Merle isn't here, so I think text gets the last word. We have no more comments in either chat app here. I had to transfer Igor myself because we've been getting 200 character messages in BlueJeans, and Slido only accepts 160 characters. That's why there were 2 from him right away. But no, we're good. This worked really well. I like how you can manage the questions in Slido. So thank you again for sharing. Anybody else have any final? Oh, see, we got more thank yous coming in from Catherine and comment that it's really
Hi
interesting.
everyone, this is Igor. I have actually one more question. I will do voice right now. So first of all, thank you for your presentation, Dimitris. This was really insightful. What you were talking about is about localizing software, right? So product strings, phrases, etc., tied to actual product. But modern software companies do a lot more translation beyond just product. App store descriptions, release notes, marketing materials, like everything, right? So how do you envision modern companies working with tools like that? Is it always like they have to work with like Transifex or a similar software-oriented platform for product and then do a more traditional TMS for everything else? Or do you envision like having all-in-one platforms is something that software companies actually ask you for when you were doing this research?
I think a lot of the elements that we talked about apply to also CMSs and documentation sites, like metadata on top of the content, or allow you to actually I think metadata is probably like the most important one. Why? Because in a CMS, you can actually go and edit the source content. You can actually go and you don't have the syntax issue. Your content is already kind of centralized in the CMS, right? So a lot of the problems that we're having with all these files scattered around is just not there yet. And also the CMS is software. So if you install a plugin in a CMS, it can do a lot of these things. I can think of a couple of things that are problematic. One is that not all CMSs support localization really well. And for a big company like LinkedIn, etc., like they will control their documentation side, but there's a ton of companies that use Zendesk and Help Scout and a ton of others for their documentation side. And those platforms, internationalization libraries support, it's not perfect. It doesn't support metadata, it doesn't support context, etc. So it's not always really easy to offer a lot of this functionality, even for a CMS. Having said that, there are a couple of elements that are really important for CMSs as well. One is metadata, again, phrase popularity and things like that. Number two is that we have this request from a couple of our larger customers, where they would like to bring all their content centrally and manage it centrally so that they know that this phrase, how is it translated, or where does this term show up across all our platforms, across our products, across our backend products, across the small apps that in Lyft is used by drivers to get trained. It's not just, Lyft doesn't have one app, it has probably like 50 apps in total. So how do we have all our content across all our platforms, and where can we see it all together? So that's one area where having everything centrally can actually help. But yeah, coming to the core part of your question, I don't think like a ton of the value is so important for CMS translation. It's less prominent for CMS translations. Igor, do you agree?
It depends on the customer and their localization maturity, if you will. Some people are willing to have everything centralized in their platform, and they're looking for the tool, for the platform that allows to do both software localization and marketing materials at the same time. This simplifies the management, right? Some companies, especially larger enterprise companies, they already work as several smaller companies, if you will. So their product department uses one tool versus the marketing department uses the other. And they have different teams, different tools, different processes. And they already kind of like separated apart within a large org, so they don't want to have a single tool. So it really depends. But I was just wondering if you were asking this question specifically when you were doing this research, and whether what is the need out there? What is the general feeling about having a single platform that supports everything, or just having a dedicated software localization platform for those specific things?
Okay, I get the question now much more clearly, to be honest. So I think sophisticated companies really want the best tool for the job. We have a lot of our customers just use us for their product teams, and we're okay with that. So as a company, we're very opinionated, obviously, making sure that we first make sure that the product teams have like the best tools that they can have, and then like the rest of the teams. Many of our customers, in fact, the majority of our customers are using us for both marketing, documentation, and product, but we're definitely like focusing more on product. And yeah, like I think my personal opinion, Igor, is bringing everything to a single tool is overrated. Personally, I would do the same. I would choose the best tool for the job. And like you said, there are features in CMSs that are kind of a stretch for what Transifex does, especially with a small development team. And we're not really doing an amazing job there. We are doing an amazing job, I think, with product phrases. So we're not pushing really customers to just adopt us for everything. I think if some companies, if they try that, in fact, they will not have a great experience.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Okay, well, there's more thank yous rolling in at yet another thank you. Every time I look at Blue Jeans, there's another thank you. And I
Thanks for
thank you,
having me,
and we all
everyone.
thank you.
This was cool.
It's very interesting. And if you scroll up, Yuka was saying she had questions during your last presentation, and you answered them tonight so clearly. For example, she was wondering, they were wondering what the reason why it was open source. Now she knows. Thank you very much. And
Cool.
Lots more.
Thanks everyone for investing time and being here. And thanks to the team for hosting me.
Glad to do it. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Perfect.
Cool.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dimitris. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Take care, everyone. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Have a
Bye,
good
everyone.
night.